Again, the lecture is lecture number 5, the Presidency and African Americans, the Presidency, Politics, and African American Civil Rights. And we've talked a lot about presidents as we've gone all the way back to think about the first and second lectures that I gave, talking about really historical events that happened. And this is specifically going to look at a handful of presidents throughout our history and their backgrounds and what their background brought to their presidency and help to explain their positions on civil rights or lack thereof. And I think it's very important to remember that presidents are humans, right? They're human beings, and they have lived lives before they were presidents. And it helps shape who they are, as your history and background has helped shape who you are, as it has helped shape who I am. It all, it's like a snowball effect. It all rolls into each particular president's. Hello. We are just getting started with lecture 5, the Presidency and African American Civil Rights. So we are just getting started with that. This is lecture 5. Again, we have a couple of folks that are joining us. John is here, Law is here, Emily is here, Mark and Tyrell are here. So I am recording the lecture for Keith, since Blackboard's being really special, as I'm sure you all know. Again, this is lecture 5, and it's set up the same as all the other lectures. We've got an objective, and I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you, and I'll tell you. So the objective here for this one is to examine the record of the presidency. And again, I can't hit all 45 presidents. I'm going to hit a handful and focus on their background and what they brought to the office because of their background in some cases, and in some cases what they didn't bring into the office because of their background. And we'll look at the institutionality, this is letter A, as the institution of the presidency, not individual presidents, but the institution interacts with civil rights or does not, and some limitations and possibilities. And as I said before, we'll look at their personality. And personality plays a big role in this issue. In any issue, presidents' personalities are really important and key to understanding how they relate to their voters, how they relate to other world leaders, how they relate to particular issues. I think it's really important to remember, again, presidents are humans. They come with baggage, right, with experiences and personalities that they bring with them. They bring all that stuff with them when they enter the office. We'll look at 3 distinct phases, basically 1790 up to Lincoln. That's up to 1865. We'll look at the next distinct phase will be 1865 to 1932. That's post-Civil War to the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then the final period which we will examine is 1932 to the present, which will probably go till about LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and we can talk about a handful of presidents after that as well. So things to consider and some qualifications. It's a very, very broad brush of the scope, right? There's just way too much detail to go into every single president that I'm going to be talking about. I can't go into every single detail of their lives, so it's a broad brush stroke. Please remember that. There are limitations to this. Again, I can't do it all here. There are some limitations. I will not be covering everything. And I think that, it's important that we look at 4 key elements that we're going to examine, including personality. We've just gotten started. This is lecture 5. Including personality, looking at all presidents operate within a highly politicized environment. Everything is politics, and those of you who are watching West Wing in the other course probably have a better understanding of this than others, that it is highly political all the time, right? It's politically charged all the time, things are happening. That attitudes towards civil rights and impacts on civil rights movement By presidents, we will examine that, and whether they engage or don't engage, we'll examine that as well. And finally, letter G talks about conservative, careful movements. And conservative meaning slow, sometimes calculated, sometimes not, but slow progress being made. It's not an immediate fix, right? As slavery, the end of slavery, there was no immediate fix to the end of slavery. So the advance and progress on civil rights is also not going to be immediate, as we know. So we'll look at each of those. So we'll start first with that first period that I was going to examine, basically from 1790, our first president, George Washington, up to Abraham Lincoln, and there will be about 3 presidents that I'm going to look at in that time frame, and I'm going to start with George Washington. George Washington, our first president, of course, it's not, before I was talking about him, it's not a great history. In the beginning, of course, we know before Abraham Lincoln, there was no discussion about civil rights. I don't even think that term was around, right? So the idea of protecting somebody's civil rights, nobody would have thought about that terminology because it just wasn't a thing that people were discussing. They weren't paying any attention to it. It was not of any significance. There was very little focus on African Americans at the time. If we're looking at the time of George Washington, of course, we're talking about slaves, and there was no thought about protections of civil rights of slaves. What would do that? In terms of Washington himself, Washington was from Virginia. He was the second son of a plantation owner, and as the second son, you were not, if you're the second son, you don't inherit anything. So if, for example, Mark is the oldest son in a family that was a plantation owner, and the second oldest is Law, you get everything. Congratulations, Mark. Law, you get nothing. Go out in the world, make your own way. And that's what George Washington had to do. He did not inherit the money. He did not inherit slaves. He did not inherit land. It was up to him to make his own way. He got involved. He was a surveyor. He joined the British military. He got a lot of skills there. Obviously, he's going to parlay those into his revolutionary activity. But the main point is he doesn't own slaves until he gets married. He married a woman named Martha. Martha had been married before. Her husband died. Martha Washington had 2 daughters with her previous husband. Actually, George Washington and Martha never had any children. So George Washington never had any biological children of his own. But Martha Washington came from a family that had a lot of slaves. So Washington inherits slaves because of his marriage with Martha Washington. At the end of his life, he freed almost all of his slaves. And that was not something that people did. It was an unusual act that he would do that at the time. He dies right around 1800. It was not something that wealthy people tended to do if they owned slaves. He did. There's no indication as to why he did that. If he felt it was his Christian duty to free his slaves, if he thought slavery was wrong, he never indicated that at any point in any writing or any public address that he may have given. We just know that he did emancipate or free most of his slaves towards the end of his life. So that's Washington. I'm going to leap just one president, that's John Adams, who did not own slaves. He was from Massachusetts. And then go to our third president, which is President Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson was from Virginia. Wealthy landowner. He did own slaves. When he marries, he gets more slaves, probably around 1 to 200. We think that he probably had at any given time. And Jefferson is just complicated. He writes the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, which we talked about that when I gave that lecture, right? Does it really mean all men are created equal? And we determined, no, it really didn't mean that, and yet he writes those words, and they are held up as, signs of the revolution. We are all created equal, and we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it doesn't mean everybody, but the words are there. It's very conflicted. He owns slaves. His story gets more complicated. He and his wife were married for quite a while. They had a couple of girls. Also, his wife also passes away. When he became president in 1804, 1800, and he becomes president in 1800, he moves into the White House. He's actually the first president to formally live there. It was under construction. Adams, before him, had lived there for like 3 weeks, and then Jefferson became president and moves in. But he doesn't have a first lady. Both Washington had his daughters that sort of took over that role, and Martha Washington certainly held that role. John Adams had his wife, Abigail, but Jefferson does not. So who's going to take over the hostess roles, if you will? When Jefferson was Secretary of State, he spent a lot of time in France, and before that, even during the Revolutionary War, he was ambassador to France. He spent a lot of time in France. And when he went to France, when he discovered he was going to become the ambassador, he brought along his daughters, and he brought along a slave to help take care of them. Slave's name was Sally Hemings, and he brings her to help take care of the children. She's a few years older than the children. He's going off and doing ambassador things. Here's the thing. In France, there was no slavery. So technically, while Sally Hemings was living in France, she was technically free.
I mean, over there, they probably saw her as a nanny.
Right. She was not seen as a slave. So it's interesting that when Jefferson returns back to the United States, she returns with him. She could have stayed in France as a free woman at that point in time. She does not. She returns back with him. There was more to that relationship than Thomas Jefferson ever let on. Sally Hemings would become the hostess-ish person at the White House when he became president. And she and her 5 children lived at the White House when Thomas Jefferson was president. And people would come over to dine with the president and would often make remarks to the servants who were Sally Hemings' children. How interesting they have red hair, because Thomas Jefferson had red hair. How interesting they should have red hair. She didn't see red hair with slaves very often. It wasn't a dominant trait. And Jefferson would blow that off, and he never acknowledged a relationship between himself and Sally Hemings. Fast forward to about 2003, maybe 2004. Descendants of Sally Hemings always claimed that they were in fact descendants of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. They always claimed that. And everybody sort of just brushed that off like, no, that didn't happen. No, and you have no way to prove it, so we're not even going to acknowledge you. Pesky little thing like DNA became a thing in the early 2000s. And so there was one male descendant, and it was tricky because you had to go from male descendant, male descendant, male descendant, male descendant, male descendant. There was one male descendant living of Sally Hemings, and they did a DNA test.